So we talked to Adam Rogers last week about our recap thoughts on semifinals, and this week we wanted to kind of go through a couple things that people have asked us as coaches. Like we get questions all the time in our online program, Compete, and then our individual clients, maybe some people in the comments of our YouTube videos. So I'm going to break these down for you, Kyle. We have Mr. Ruth on because he's the big brain in the organization. We're going to go through a couple things. The first one is, and I think this is the most important, this is the question that I've been asked the most. Does the programming this year, from the Open through semifinals, we obviously haven't seen the games yet, but we've seen 3 of the stages. Does the program change, or the testing change the way that we will program moving forward? So we'll touch on that.
So first off, before we dig into that, I mean, I think if you saw
Brandon, are you trying to say all the topics?
I was going to say all the topics, but
he's already interrupted.
He's excited about it.
This one, if you're not changing your program based on the data or what you've seen or what's come out.
He can't help himself.
You've got a problem.
Yeah.
Or you need to go hire a new coach.
He's doing a tease. The tease is giving all the topics, and then we'll talk about
I can't not talk about it.
Oh, man. Kyle came in fired up this morning. How many ounces of caffeine?
Just finish the tease. Just finish the tease.
Okay, sorry. So the first one's going to be, should your program change based on the testing? And
yes.
Kyle obviously already answered. I mean, maybe some people say no. The second one's going to be, what does the future of the sport look like? Now, that's not just the programming, but also, why are you laughing so hard?
Bleak.
No, I'm kidding. Wow. Go ahead and just give us your thoughts on all
this. TV over here is going haywire.
This TV reflects my brain right now.
I mean, I just have to turn it off. Tease.
Tease.
What's the third one?
The third one is going to be, we saw a lot of injuries in the East where we were all at as coaches. We had obviously coaches out at the West as well, but we had 6 guys that withdrew for either pec injuries or some other issues. So that's 10% of the field, which, when you say 6, it's like, well, 6 out of 6 is not a lot. But if you said 10% of the athletes in any sport were getting hurt every year and having to withdraw, that's a high rate. So we'll talk about that. And then the last one is, what's the difference between those guys and girls in the top 10 of any semifinal and, let's say, from 10 to 20, like those people that are fighting for a game spot but can't get there? We want to dive into that. And then we'll also kind of touch on, what about those that maybe are in the bottom half, the first few heats that everyone's always like, I wait to watch the last few, but there are also talented athletes that are in those bottom heats, but what makes the difference between getting them there or up onto the podium? So let's go ahead and jump in. We're going to start with the one that Kyle kept interrupting me on, and that is, does the testing body this year change the way that we program? Real quick, just before I let Kyle jump in, we saw this year, and we've talked about this, Adam and I talked about this last week, the Open, we saw an old school test with test number 1, but then we also saw some bottleneck tests with the shuttle run and burpee pull-up, the 1RM thruster, and some of the other things that happen in the Open. In quarterfinals, it became very apparent with, like, even, for example, test 1, where the handstand push-up just bottlenecked everyone. So really, you could fly through that workout, and we saw athletes here do it in 7 minutes and 30 seconds through. And then they got to the handstand push-ups, and it took them another 7.5 minutes, or they got capped on the workout because that was a huge bottleneck. The same thing with the clean and jerks in one of the future events. The same thing with the V-ups. The same thing with the rope climbs in the last event. So these workouts were different in that instead of having those kind of fast-paced kind of you just have to be able to move and breathe or have really good movement patterns, it came down to one movement in particular. And then the same thing happened in semifinals. We talked about this again with Adam last week, but the sled pull in event 1, event 2 had the complex of ring muscle-ups, which was a huge bottleneck, and even the unbroken pistols. Event 3, the dumbbell bench became a huge bottleneck, especially on the female side. Event 4, it was only about the snatch. The run didn't matter at all, which we thought was silly, but that changes the way maybe we think about how we add running into heavy lifts. Event 5, really the barbell didn't matter as much as we wanted it to. The 8 touch and go snatches for almost everyone, they just got on and it all came down to the run. Event 6 was all legless rope climbs and maybe handstand push-ups. And then even event 7, where everyone said, oh, we finally got a well-rounded test, only came down to the echo bike. So I'm picking these apart, but it's very apparent to us as coaches when you look at these, you got to be good at one thing in the test, and very few of them were well-rounded. So I'm going to throw it to you, Kyle. Do we change the way we program based on the testing body?
Okay, so first off, as I alluded to in the preview, like, you have no choice but to change your programming based on the test. If you're not, then you're not adapting with the sport. We compete and coach and operate in this environment of the unknown and unknowable and a constantly changing, constantly variable sport. That's the definition of what we do. And there's a lot of people who have complained that, like, okay, the sport is really different than it used to be. Yeah, it's a constantly varied sport. So you should expect that. Like, this is what we compete in. So absolutely, your programming and your approach should change every year based on the new information, the new data that you get from the tests. And I think what we saw this year is that, at least for this year, there's a pretty significant, as you call it, a bottleneck bias, right? Where every test has some skill or load or element that just basically grinds most people to a halt. Now, those things were not bottlenecks for everybody. Like,
Sure.
the legless rope climb from an L-sit, watching Noah, that wasn't a bottleneck for Noah. Noah basically just like slow jogged his way through that entire workout. Now, was it a capacity test for him? No. But it was clearly just like, it wasn't a walk in the park, but it was somewhere between a zone 2 jog and a sprint.
For the very best in the sport, there may not have been when we say bottleneck, we just mean something that you literally are just like stuck there. You can't move past that, or you have to take extremely long breaks. So therefore you are not testing your, cardiac ability or like even really your local musculature because you have to wait so long to be able to get up and down the rope.
For a lot of people at semifinals, that 90 pound and 60 pound dumbbell in Linda is a great example of that. You either had the capacity to do the 55 total reps of, 90 and 60 pound dumbbell bench press, or you didn't. And if you didn't, you were just going to be sitting and kind of staring at the dumbbells or sitting with the dumbbells on your lap for a lot of the workout. And so
I want to push back on this just real quick, because you talked about Noah and how he did make it look very easy. And Medeiros did the same thing. Medeiros actually beat his time in the West, and it looked, like it was flawless, like very good execution. However, 25 guys got capped in that workout of the best guys in the world in the semifinals in the West. And I think it was around that same number, maybe a little bit less, like 20 guys got capped in the East. That is a third or more than a third of the people that are competing getting capped on a workout. And that didn't happen just in that one. It also happened in almost all the workouts.
Right. So to be clear, I'm not saying that these workouts weren't designed with bottlenecks in them. I'm simply saying that there are people who are going to be able to move through pretty much any workout. There's always going to be one or two that don't have bottlenecks. Now, as soon as we go outside of that, top like 0.0001% of people, then you're talking about how do we change training in accordance to this. And I think there's two things we have to look at here. First is, what were the bottlenecks? They tended to be either gymnastics or load based. Yes. And so if they were trying to make sure that you're strong enough on the load based stuff, and then they were trying to make sure that you had high level gymnastic skills and could do them under fatigue. That right there tells you what you should be doing in your training.
Prevost commented on our video with Adam saying that she thought that most of these bottlenecks were upper body. Did you see that comment, Adam?
And especially for the female athletes. Yes. Look, the reality is that there's a difference biologically between males and females, and there's a difference in upper body strength in particular. And because of that, we need to think about the testing body in a way that accommodates for that. So the tests are at least similar in, what capacity you're testing. When you put heavy dumbbells or a complex of muscle ups with a vest on, it changes the dynamic for a female versus a male.
So how does that impact programming? You said you had 2 points.
Yeah. Well, I think the other point is very different, and it's the following. Do you remember the year that they did, I think it was 2017, where all the tests at regionals were extremely no.
Oh, okay.
Before that, they were all extremely heavy. It was, I think, the year of the snatch ladder up to 265, and it may have even been Linda that year.
Yeah, they may have done Linda heavy
barbell,
deadlift or something.
It was just packed full of heavy loads. Then the next year, they took all of that out and did the dumbbells and the sandbags. So there's a possibility that this is like a bait and switch, right? So they're like, everybody get your skills up to snuff. Make sure that you're ready to do all this upper body gymnastics stuff under fatigue. You build your gymnastics capacity and gymnastic strength and all this stuff. And then next year, we don't see anything like this.
Well, so what would be the downside then? So let's say you switched your programming and you were like, I'm going to be a bottleneck master, right?
Because when
they go back to, say, more Dave Castro style programming, is there any harm done there?
Yes. Because when you spend the majority of your time in bottleneck style workouts, you don't really get your heart rate up that high relative to some of the a classic example would be, was it 20.1? That's,
it's a power snatch and
power
burpee.
snatch burpee, which is like the most classic Castro.
That's a perfect
test.
example of something that you could just kind of fly through. Even if you're not good at those movements, there's nothing that's going to just completely stop you in your tracks. Like, yes, you're going to slow down on snatches. Yes, you're going to slow down on burpees, but everyone could keep moving through there. Whereas if you're doing a seated L legless rope climb, there's just going to be a point where people have to rest for 2 to 3 minutes. And we saw semifinal athletes. I saw an athlete in one of the final heats have to rest for 3 minutes before they started another seated L in the female side.
Damn.
Yeah.
That's crazy. Think about that. 3 minutes. Your heart rate's back down under 120. So you're like you're not at resting heart rate, but you're basically at baseline heart rate after that. So I think that's the point, Chris, is like if they pull a bait and switch, people are that look at this year and they're like, this is what all the programming is going to be like from now on. If they make that assumption, they may bottleneck themselves next year because they don't have the capacity if they do a bait and switch. Now, I'm not suggesting that that's what they're going to do at all. I'm just saying that is one potential concern. If you say, oh man, everything's bottlenecked, we need to train as heavy as possible. We need to go all upper body, like dense gymnastic stuff. And I love programming that kind of stuff where it's like rope climb, handstand walk into handstand push up. Like those combinations are nasty and you just end up standing there looking at the wall, not able to do, strict handstand push-ups.
Here's the way that we think about it, especially with just like when we're writing for our athletes, is this time of year. So let's just say like semifinal athletes, they just finished, they're going to take some time off. But let's just say you were the one that was bottlenecked in quarterfinals and now you're already back to training. Like this is your off season and you're thinking about how do I get better at all those bottlenecks while also maintaining my, let's just call it quote unquote engine. Like I know that's very broad, but that's what people are always thinking about. Like old school CrossFit, that 20.1, you have to have a good engine, right? The beginning of your kind of off-season period can be a great time to build in the bottleneck bias. Really focus on those limiters. Make sure that you're getting better at rope climbs, get better at handstand push-ups, get better at handstand walk, whatever those bottlenecks were, and get better at strength. Like this is a good time to really develop all of those things. It's almost like you're building that foundation like we've talked about in the past of like this house that you want to build by the open, like this beautiful walls and all that. On the inside, you got to build the foundation first. Then you move into what we'll call your in-season prep, and that's when you would go back to kind of that old school where you're still touching the bottlenecks, you're still doing the seated L rope climbs and you're working on all those things, but you're almost testing the waters a little bit more where now you can add them into a Metcon to see, does it still bottleneck me? And if it does, well, I need to build my engine. So you can either do that with a lot of cyclical based stuff, or you take out the complex movements and do more classic CrossFit work. So you're still getting the chaos of CrossFit while still building your engine because you can move quickly.
To that point, I think, when you're in that second phase where you are starting to move to something that's a little more, we'll call it sport specific, even though the bottlenecks are relatively sport specific for this year. But just like if you're developing a broad base, when you move into that second phase, what you can do is you can construct Metcons or have a program that constructs Metcons where they start with the simplistic movements and, test your capacity and then finish with the complex high skill stuff under fatigue. Because if you look at the programming, really that's what they tried to do. Even that, you've touched on that legless, L-sit or seated rope climb a couple times. That whole workout was designed to create pre-fatigue for that, L-sit rope climb.
Right.
And then basically anything afterward, it was just a capacity test. Like, hey, now it's time to go. Now it's time to sprint. And so if you spend the early part of your season developing those bottlenecks so that you're not just sitting there looking at the rope or not just sitting there, waiting on your hands and knees to get back up on the wall to do another set of wall facing handstand push-ups. If you build that first and then you start to take it into Metcons and then you put it at the end of the Metcon so it's not creating a bottleneck that prevents you from developing capacity early on in the workout. So a simple example would be like bar facing burpee and power snatch, right? Like 3 rounds of 20 and 20 into 3 rounds of 10. Ring muscle ups for most people would be one of those high level bottleneck skills. Yeah. And then 5 squat snatch at 185, 125.
Right.
Like that would be a really simple example of something that tests capacity first and then moves into the higher level skills. But you have to have a high degree of proficiency with those high level skills first before you can put them into those kind of formats.
Yeah. The other thing I've been thinking about is now, if the testing stays this way, and even if it doesn't, even if he shifts back to kind of let's just call it the Castro style, that was truly more capacity based, go fast, move. There's not really a huge sticking point in the workout. There will be some workouts like we saw at the games last year that they are going to throw in those things that just you have to be really good at: a strict pegboard, the legless rope climb variations, different handstand push-up variations, always making, it's almost like we're just taking the gymnastics one step farther each year, which I'm fine with if it's 1 or 2 tests, not all the tests. But that means even more so that your technique on the gymnastics new movements, needs to be really solid. So we've talked about this for years. Like, hey, take your time in the off season to build really high quality gymnastics movement efficiency. Like, have good movement economy with the ring muscle up, and even like something simple like the toe to bar. People don't think about it. They're just like, oh, I just swing my legs up. But learning how to breathe and move your body in that kip swing efficiently will help you when you get back to the CrossFit. Now, with things like a rucksack doing a muscle up, or if you have to truly do a seated L legless rope climb, or a wall facing handstand push up, a deficit handstand push up, pirouettes on your hands, you need to learn how to stack properly on your hands so you can turn efficiently with a pirouette, or you name the skill, right? Yeah. So I think even more than ever, people need to start thinking about the basics, like the fundamentals, and fix those right now, this time of year, so that they can get into sport-specific stuff later on.
There's so many examples of that from this season. A great one is the pirouette, right? So everybody that was competing at semifinals could handstand walk, right? They did whatever that giant buy-in of handstand walk was in test one from quarterfinals. So everyone can handstand walk, but being able to handstand walk with like a scorpion technique, right? Like, you're probably good at it. You can probably do the
in a straight line,
200-foot buy-in with no problem. You might even be able to get yourself over a ramp and stairs, because sometimes that requires you to get your body into a pretty, kind of spinal extended position. But now we have this movement where you have to turn a 360 degree, the pirouette 360 degrees in this little box. And if you're in that scorpion position, there's no chance you're going to be able to do it. So it does come down to having good fundamentals. I think the same can be said for the crossover singles. The people who got really bottlenecked by the crossover singles in quarterfinals test 2 and the dumbbell snatch crossover single, man, if all you've done is singles and then learn doubles and then just built capacity in doubles, like you've never done any of the other rope skills that exist, which, in some sense, if you look at like the double under program that we have, it starts with really basic stuff. It starts even things like turning a 360 degree circle while doing single unders, right? Yeah. Which most people can't do. But if you've gone through that program, like you've spent time doing speed steps, crossovers, all of those little basic elements that actually build up to make your double unders better. And I think there's something to be said for going back and, if you got exposed this season, going back and using your off season to revisit basics. V-ups. If you got bottlenecked bad by V-ups, and some of my athletes did, that's basic trunk flexion stuff. That's a hole in programming. Yes, I'm responsible for that because I didn't address it well, but it also hadn't been tested in the sport. So, maybe I can't be blamed there, or maybe I should be blamed. But with that being said, if we had just, started with basics, some of these people were CrossFitters from when they were young, started when they were 13 or 14. So they didn't have other sports that they were exposed to where they did, pike ups and things like that you do when, I did those in swimming for years. And so I was like used to doing pike ups and V-ups and stuff like that. So I did go through that foundation phase, but a lot of people didn't have that, whether that because they started in CrossFit or they started in other, runners, they probably didn't do a lot of V-ups at any point because that's not a foundational movement, but gymnasts, they did a ton of V-ups. And so just going back and revisiting some of the foundational movements for gymnastics, because clearly there's a gymnastics bias now, like you mentioned, I think would be really smart, but then also doing the same thing for weightlifting basics, going back and reviewing the basics for things like double unders, reviewing the basics for rowing mechanics, running mechanics, and things like that. That's an off season, right?
And we're going to talk about this in a little bit, but what's the difference between the top 10 and, 10 to 20, the people that are fighting for those game spots? And a lot of that is the small details. Those people are very similar if it's just like a very basic test, like something that doesn't require a lot of like movement efficiency or whatever you want to call it, like the bottleneck style stuff. Yeah. But it does get exposed when crossover singles or doubles come out, and one person has been practicing it since they came out last year at the games, and another person says, oh, they're never going to come out again, or I don't need to worry about that, I'll figure it out on the fly. There's a huge difference when you're under pressure on the floor. And so, again, this is just me, I think, encouraging our listeners, and I've encouraged all our athletes in our online program, all my individual athletes, take time now to fix those basics. And you talked about V-ups as a perfect example. We have an extra credit program that's running right now on our online program that's all about V-up and core compression, learning how to do that well now. And it's not something that will run all year, right? But it's things that we'll continue to layer in so that people are really good at them. Let's say they never come out again. Great. You have better core compression, so you can do things like toes to bar, GHD sit-ups, any hinging pattern. All of those things will be improved by learning the basics on something else.
All right, so how do you wrap a bow on how you guys are going to think about programming for next year based on these tests so far?
So it's not going to change the premise. Our premise has always been start with the basics in the off season, go back and revisit the basics. Now it's just going to be, we're going to cast a wider net over a bigger set of basics just based on what was released this year, like L-sits, V-ups, crossover, more complex jump rope skills, et cetera, et cetera. And especially for my female athletes, we're going to spend way more time building upper body strength.
Totally. Yeah, upper body strength is a huge one. And then one of the things that we're doing that we are offering all our athletes, we decided we have these great fixed length programs that basically it's just focusing on one skill, maybe butterfly chest bar pull-ups, rope climbs, you name it, like all those things we've already talked about. We built those out in our app so that all our coaches can drag and drop, or people that are in our online program can drag and drop. And the reason I'm bringing this up is not as a selling point,
but
it'll come out July 3rd. That's when we're posting it. But basically we sat down as coaches and we're like, we still want to have a well-rounded program where we're continuing on the path that we know is best for the sport, just historically and then obviously within what we've seen this year. But to Kyle's point, we don't want to shift so far over to just bottleneck style training that people don't have good quote-unquote engines next year or can't race because there wasn't a lot of racing this year. We still want people to race.
You can't lose your fitness.
Exactly. You can't lose your fitness. But we need to give them opportunity if they have something that they're really bad at. Like for me, it is crossover singles or just even double unders, like bounding mechanics are bad. I want to have a program for those people that is long but focused so that they can really work on that skill. So we have all these 12-week programs now that people can add on.
How are you having people add them in though?
Yeah, so with our individual clients, the coach is doing that. So like Kyle is going to look at his athlete and, let's say I'm his athlete. He needs to work on double unders. He could add that into my program and tell me exactly what day to put it on. For those that are in compete, they'll have a list and they can, in the app, literally just click on subscribe. Then a coach will make sure that they have it on the right day. So it's almost an individualized program and a group style program, if that makes sense.
But it's mixed in with your training. So
it's mixed in with your training.
Dedicated days where I'm focusing on the skill.
Yeah, so like if you just decide I'm going to put it on a Wednesday because in the PM I don't have, I'm not busy at work or whatever, then they could add that to their Wednesday PM and it's easy for them to just drag and drop onto that Wednesday so that they can do it. So they can pick whatever day, or again, a coach will help them decide which day. But the point of all that is we still want to make sure that we're focused on building fitness, but also know that the priority too needs to be making sure these skills are really dialed in, because I think we're going to continue to see, even if all the tests aren't bottlenecked, the almost complexity or the challenge of each of these movements will continue to get harder and harder. So we need to make sure we're layering that in for our athletes.
That was going to be my question for you is, do you think that one of the things that Bosman's going to try and do is every year add new novel movements that are kind of like a step up, or just movements that are in general new to people in CrossFit? So like we saw that with a handful of movements like the V-up, the crossover singles, the seated rope climbs. Do you think that's now the thing, is trying to add new novel movements?
Yeah, if I had a bet, I would bet on that. That just kind of seems like his bias. We talked about this in a podcast probably 6 months ago, or maybe even more, where I went back and tried to find all the workouts that I assumed he programmed when he was at San Francisco CrossFit, and a lot of these movements were in there. And that's what we talked about as a coaching staff, like, hey, a lot of high-level gymnastics movements that they were programming 8 years ago or whenever he was there. And I don't know if he programmed those. Like, it doesn't say written by Bosman, but we know he was there at the time helping write workouts. We looked at those, and there was a lot of kettlebells. There were a lot of crossover variations, Turkish get-ups, like all these kind of random things. So we added those into our programs. And honestly, Adam talked about this in the podcast last week, but I was very happy with how we prepared our semifinal athletes. They did every movement that was tested. It just may not have been the same complexity like the ring muscle-up complex, but they did ruck-weighted muscle-ups.
They touched on them, but now the lesson is they need to do more of it.
Correct.
We touched on them, but maybe not enough.
Correct.
All right. What's our next topic?
Well, real quick, I just wanted to ask Kyle one last thing. Stop. Just enjoy the time we have. We have some coffee right here.
I don't have any coffee.
Do you think I'll get you some coffee? To wrap this up, do you think, I mentioned this, 30 people got capped in some of these workouts. Do you think that everyone will be able to get through those style workouts next year? Like everyone's going to work on it and it will really improve the sport, or will those still be things that just like are completely time capped?
I don't think they were like poorly programmed from the sense that the caps were too short or anything like that. I think people were ill prepared for the workouts. And I think that given a year of preparation with 90 and 60 pound dumbbells and ruck muscle ups, that people are going to be really damn good at them. That's what if there's one thing to be said for the athletes in this sport, it's when they're introduced to a new novel movement or a new challenge, man, they rise to it, and quickly within a year. Now, I do think, if we're 20 years from now, we may not see that anymore. Like the rate of progress may just be slower because everyone will be doing a good job of prepping for pretty much everything that can be programmed. But like for now, people are going to come back next year and they're going to be able to hammer this stuff.
Yeah. And that leads me into the next topic, which is what does the future of the sport look like? So
Hope you enjoyed this clip from episode 134 of the Corpus Animus podcast. To hear the other clips, you can click here on the screen or listen to the audio version in full on all major podcast providers.